Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Ream Library. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. We sponsor lectures, conferences, a variety of events on campus that help focus attention on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. One of the great pleasures that I have under the aegis of the McFarland Center is to coordinate with Professor Alan Avery Peck, our Kraft-Hiatt professor, and with a great group of faculty colleagues, the Kraft-Hiatt program in Jewish Christian Understanding, which makes it possible for us to be here today. Through the fund, we have been able to enrich teaching and learning on the Holocaust, on Jewish history, contemporary Jewish life, and on Jewish-Christian relations. In recent years, we've been very fortunate to host Alan Rosen, a renowned scholar of Holocaust literature, as our Kraft-Hiatt Scholar-in-Residence. Many students have told us about what a deep impression his talks and classroom visits have made on them over the years. So we're honored to welcome him back each year. Over the last couple of days, Alan has joined 6 classes, so we really put him to work, but he was willing to be put to work, and I've heard great things about the effect in those classes. The topic of today's talk is an outcome of a discussion that began last year with some of those students and with faculty on the ethics of commemoration. Alan is lecturer of Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, and has held fellowships at the Fondation pour la Mémoire de Shoah in Paris, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He earned his PhD in literature and religion under the supervision of the late Nobel Prize winner and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel. Many of you know him from his work Night and other works that Alan is working to bring to the fore. Alan's taught Holocaust literature at colleges and universities in Israel and the United States, and in recent years also has taken a historical turn to his work that he talked about in historiography class with some students. He's author of The Wonder of Their Voices, the 1946 Holocaust Interviews with David Broder, Sounds of Defiance, The Holocaust, Multilingualism, and the Problem of English, and Dislocating the End, Climax, Closure, and the Invention of Genre. He's the editor of a volume on literature on the Holocaust and a number of collections reflecting on Elie Wiesel's work, and has a new collection of Wiesel's work coming out next year. His most recent book, The Holocaust Jewish Calendars, Keeping Time Sacred, Making Time Holy, was published this year by Indiana University Press, the culmination of a project that he first spoke about here in 2011. And you can actually listen to that talk, among others, online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center, where this talk will also be in a couple of days. It's always wonderful to have Alan Rosen back on campus, and please join me in welcoming him.
In a synagogue in the center of the neighborhood that I live in Jerusalem, called Hasidim. The neighborhood is Bayit Gan. And this is a synagogue that holds maybe 400 people, not huge, but large by our standards. Somewhat bigger than this library auditorium. At the center, like in many synagogues, is a lectern that is used for the reading of the Torah. It's covered with a magenta-colored velour, beautifully rich royal covering, as is the custom in synagogues as well. And it's upon that the Torah is carried from the Torah ark at the front, laid, and every Sabbath day, and on holidays in this big space, it's read from in the reading for the week by a trained reader that varies depending on the occasion. On the front of that covering, hanging over, facing those who are sitting in the rear of the shul, I guess according to Tom Landy standards, those who aren't as brave as who come to the front. But I'm not sure that's entirely the case. But on the front of that there is a printed inscription in Hebrew that I'll read in translation. For the elevation of the soul of Rabbi Moshe David of righteous memory, and for his daughter Sarah Pessa, may she rest in peace, who were murdered in the Holocaust, Al Kiddush Hashem, for the sanctity of God's name, may God avenge their blood. And the bottom line reads, donated by his wife and her mother, Tzipora Lazar, may she live and be well. This is certainly not the exception in my neighborhood and in Jerusalem overall in terms of coverings for what's called the bima, the lectern on which the Torah is read, also the lectern on which the prayer leader says the prayers, and many other areas in the synagogue which bear often similar descriptions. And these were inscribed often in the years just following the war, 1940s, but also in the decades following. And it is thus that those inscriptions are looked at, or one might say taken for granted by the congregation that comes. In other words, the synagogue is populated not only by those who come to pray and to hear the Torah reading, but it's populated by those whose soul is to be elevated by this. And so a very subtle but pervasive way of remembering the Holocaust comes in these beautifully velour coverings that are inscribed with the name of a father and a daughter who were murdered and may well have otherwise disappeared into the mist of those terrible years. So the premise, really, one premise of my talk tonight is based on that kind of pervasive inscriptions on the lectern, on the Torah ark covering, wherever there is room, the names of those who were murdered but whose souls need to be elevated are brought for commemoration. And all of the Jews all over the world partake of this care. And it really addresses me with the fact that it seems we don't remember the Holocaust as much as we try to remember the people, the child. We don't know how old she was or wasn't, her father, her uncle. What is being done by having their name inscribed on the Torah lectern is that every time that Torah is read, every verse, every word is done to commemorate them. So there is a drive to be able to do what in Hebrew we call mitzvahs, that are done on their behalf with a basic understanding that they in the next world can't do it any longer. So it's our charge, it's our mission to be able to do them for them. We are their hands, their arms, their legs. And that's how we commemorate the Holocaust, or commemorate, as I had shaded it, commemorate the people. So tonight, we have as our task looking at memory as protest, how and why we remember the Holocaust, to explore at least a bit of this huge subject, huge because of the extent of the losses, huge because of the time period involved, huge because there are so many different modalities, so many different ways to do. And what I hope to tonight to perhaps review is, in a way, a kind of grammar of Jewish commemoration, which is why I started with the synagogue and the Torah reading at the center. So I would be able to inform those who are not necessarily Jewish or part of the Jewish community, which I presume there are in the audience tonight, gratefully, about what constitutes the kinds of activities of commemoration in terms of this grammar, this lexicon of commemoration. But we won't only stay there. We'll also branch out and broaden to a larger spectrum. And even though we'll cover only a fraction of what is there, that hopefully there will be at least a modicum of further being equipped by our study together tonight to be able to think richly about commemoration. Because commemoration is not a historical fact as much as it is an ongoing activity that each and every one of us are involved in. But before going further, I want to give thanks to Tom Landy, Professor Tom Landy, who organizes my talks and my visits here, which have so many different layers and are so fine in my being able to meet the outstanding students that populate this college, and the great faculty that forms the Kraft-Hiatt committee, and the other faculty that Tom lassos in to have me in their classrooms. And I want to mention that last year when I was here, it was directly in the wake of the terrible killings at the Pittsburgh Synagogue, Tree of Life. And I was stunned by the way that the college was engaged with those events, feeling the losses, wanting to do whatever they could to respond. And there was a vigil staged. It which is very moving to me, because I thought that it was just something parochial, separate, but my visit here showed me it really wasn't. It affected all, to the credit of you all. And the anniversary of that loss was commemorated in the secular calendar already some days ago, but in the Jewish calendar, which is what we call the yahrzeit, the Yom HaZikaron, the year that is passed according to the Jewish calendar, which we understand to be the spiritual anniversary. That's coming this coming Sabbath day, the 18th day of the month of Cheshvan, which in the Jewish calendar we're in. And that's the day, and I'll talk more about this as we go on in its various facets, that commemorative activities will take place for the families that lost dear ones, the saying of Kaddish and other activities, memorial prayers, lighting a candle. And so, as I did last year, I want to suggest that if you're feeling the tug of that memory and the sense of wanting to respond, you can do that by sending a note. It can be a sentence. I remember the tragic loss. My thoughts are with you. My prayers are for the ones whose lives were lost or damaged. You can go to the website of the Tree of Life Synagogue, and there you will be able to send it. It will take all of a minute. And those who are crying and experiencing the intensity of that loss on that special day will say, how could it be? Someone completely outside of my life and my community is remembering with me. And the sense of comfort that that brings is perhaps the deepest form of commemoration. Tonight, in the Jewish calendar, is also another very important anniversary, which is that of the Kristallnacht pogrom, which is commemorated usually in the secular calendar on the 9th or 10th of November, which were the dates that it took place in Germany in 1938. But in the Jewish calendar, again, on the day that the families who experienced that loss will do the memorial prayers, will light a memorial candle. It's tonight and tomorrow. So what more fitting time for us to meet and explore the parameters, the lexicon of commemoration, than this night, when echoes of those memorial prayers are sounding wherever the descendants of those who were murdered, I think some 91 on the night itself. 91 souls that were eliminated from the world one night. So we can dedicate our exploration to their merit and hopefully on some level it will bring comfort not only then to them but to us. So we go further. Elie Wiesel my teacher, my mentor, writes in an early essay, very important aspect of commemoration when thinking of the Holocaust. He says, for me, writing is a matzeva, an invisible tombstone erected to the memory of the dead unburied. Each word corresponds to a face, a prayer, the one needing the other so as not to sink into oblivion, end of quote. So the framework for this is that we're commemorating a series of losses, always. There, of course, is the most obscene and terrible, which is the taking away of life, which goes against one of the 10 Commandments, and which has, I think, for all of us, priority beyond any of preserving life and refraining from taking it. But a corollary to that in relation to the Holocaust is the fact that the enemy chose to do away with many of the victims through cremation, through incineration. And what are left are only mounds of ash, terribly, obscenely. There is, as Elie Wiesel notes here, no grave. They lie unburied. And in Jewish life, Jewish culture, burial is a fundamental premise of bringing dignity to those whose life has come to an end. It's not only, of course, in Jewish culture, it's other cultures as well. But for Jews, the fact that the Bible states that we go from dust to dust means that we are obliged to return our bodies to the ground. And those bodies are taken back into the earth, back into the dust from which it's understood that we came. And that is a fundamental premise in such a way that cremation is outside of the framework of Jewish life. It's not an option, because that burial that is given confers upon the one whose life came to an end a sense of dignity as the last rites in this world, but also it forms a specific passageway to the next world. So by choosing horribly, cruelly, cruelty on top of cruelty, by having the enemy choose to incinerate the bodies and not to bury, meant that there's an absence, a loss that can't be made up. There is no body to bury. And Elie Wiesel, when one reads his writings, as well as others, is haunted by this. And it really becomes a striving for finding the idiom, finding the way to be able to give a burial through words. How can our words be shaped, be molded, be put together in such a way that can be a surrogate burial. And, as he writes here, an invisible tombstone. That which marks the grave by saying the name and the details in the words of a text, of his text, of other texts, of our text, can do that. It's the common practice among Jews who came from Europe but survived, that when they have the privilege and right of burial when their life came to an end, but they had relatives that were not given that right, that on the side of the grave is often put a list of those who lie unburied. And it's as if they, too, are sharing the grave and the tombstone of those who survived and given the dignity of a normal burial. Often, one name, two names, but sometimes 6, 7, 10 names. And it's the practice at a Jewish burial that one of the features is that it's a high privilege at the time of burial to be one of those who shovel the dirt into the grave. One is taking part in making their hands grimy to say that this dignity is something that I'm willing to give my labor to, my care to, in a completely hands-on way. So I think Elie Wiesel is pulling us to think about how those who don't have a burial can have us, as it were, symbolically, in a surrogate way, shovel that dirt. Confer the dignity that does. Go out of our way. Stoop, bend. Take the shovel in our hands, pull that dirt, and hear the thud. And that thud itself already has a kind of resonant echo that means this is the end, but it's being done in the right way. So we have to search, as Elie Wiesel did, for words that can do that. Poems, passages, scripture that might be able to confer such a final thud. Tombstones are one way in which a memorial is erected. Another way that that's done is through buildings done in culture in general to memorialize those who are lost. But in Jewish life, the proliferation of building took on, in the wake of the Holocaust, an urgency, a sense of rebuilding through bringing into existence again, in the place of those that were demolished, schools, yeshivas, synagogues, hospitals. And in my neck of the woods, same neighborhood that synagogue with the red velour and the names of Moshe David and Sarah Pessa, is a hospital, one of the great hospitals in Jerusalem, called Shari Tzedek, the gates of the righteous. It's how it translates. And it's there that not only my daughter works, but perhaps even more importantly, has more births a year, more Jewish births a year than any other hospital in the world. The figure of, say, 22,000, I think. And in the wing where the birthing takes place, there are plaques that as I walked through recently, I looked to read, and one of those plaques was dedicated by a Holocaust survivor and his wife, who never had children, never able to have children, and family was all lost. And their contribution then was to be able to make this wing, or share in the effort of making this wing, of the birthing of Jewish children at this hospital in Jerusalem, into what could commemorate his family and the losses they weathered. Not so far from where I live, Elie Wiesel built in the name of his father, Shlomo, a yeshiva where some 400 yeshiva students, shiva means a place of higher education, like a college, and it's that emblazoned on the top bears his father's name. So there is this way in which those two are a kind of tombstone, as it were, to be able to commemorate through building and rebuilding. And it's that way of reconstruction that is a vehicle for, again, the souls of the departed, who are commemorated through such efforts to be able to participate in the living, the making of a vibrant Jewish life. There are further ways with words. First of all, prayer. As I mentioned, on this night, being the anniversary of the Kristallnacht pogrom, the pogrom which in Germany took place on this date in 1938, where 91 souls were murdered, many others were injured, tens of thousands of men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. And on top of that, it's called Kristallnacht because Jewish businesses had their windows broken and shattered in most of the synagogues of Germany, which number, I think the figure was 264, were torched and destroyed. It was the time, in addition to the terrible loss of life, that for many Jews in Germany, many Jews throughout the world, and many non-Jews, the writing was there on the wall of what the Germany had become. So on this day to commemorate, we say the Kaddish prayer, which makes no mention of those who were lost, but rather speaks of magnifying God's glory. And it's a way to be able to say that in the merit of those who were lost, those whose day, that this day is a day of their leaving this world, not inhabiting it, that we're, again, as I mentioned earlier, taking on a surrogate role. We are their mouthpiece. And that prayer is really theirs, that we become the sayers of. We light a candle because the soul is compared to a candle that's burning, and in some interpretations, that candle, that fire is always going up, that we're always in the deepest part of ourselves. Our soul is always yearning toward heaven. So a candle is compared, so we light a candle that burns for 24 hours. There are special candles crafted for the occasion. We learn special sacred texts, especially the teachings in the Mishnah, part of the Talmud, which is said with the initials of the departed's name. And that, again, brings them into our midst, using the letters, using who they were. And indeed, the names becomes a very consequential way to commemorate. It's the practice to name in the European communities, to name after those who are no longer alive. Often a grandmother, grandfather, aunt, uncle, a child is named. So in naming after those whose lives were snuffed out, one returns not only the name, but in a way the glimmer of who that person was. And at the time of the ritual circumcision, in fact, there's a practice among some when a name is bestowed to someone whose life was snuffed out, to call out, and thus a name has been recalled. We're pulling like with a rope so that they remain tethered to the world that they were wrenched from. People, place, and time. People, place, and time. Survivors give us a special opportunity for commemoration, because anytime a survivor, one who went through the events, recounts their experience, they then commemorate with every name that they mention. So my collaborator on my calendar project, Sophie Zollberg, who now, she should be strong and well, is 96 years old. And when she tells the story of what happened, she makes sure that she always mentions her father's name, or her mother's name, her sister's name. In other words, she sees herself as the vehicle for perpetuating their memory. And by listening to her, one becomes a collaborator in that venture, which I've had the opportunity to do, thank God, numbers of times. And survivors afford that opportunity on many levels in addition to testimony that I've elaborated elsewhere. Place, the sites in which lives were lost. We go to those sites to feel that we are connected in a way that our distance, for example, being in America, or for that matter, being in Israel, does not allow us to do. And there is I would suggest a way that when we step on the ground on which the killings took place, the landscapes of death, that then we lose a certain innocence of having the words that we've read and the stories we've heard be attached to the ground. And even though we can't step back in time, thank God, and enter those places of Majdanek in Poland, or Auschwitz, or Treblinka, in all of their different ways of commemoration, what we do is return to that place, and by doing so, we're saying that we want to draw as close as we can. And by doing so, we're saying that that's how important is our being able to serve as vehicles for memory. Perhaps even more important is the time, what I've been referring to as the commemoration of Kristallnacht, the commemoration of the anniversary of the killings in Pittsburgh, the individual yard site of any given person. With Sophie Zollberg, who came from Munich and was deported to Auschwitz, survived 2 years there, and then moved to Israel. She had a teacher in Munich, Julius Kissinger, cousin of Henry, who taught her what she needed to know to make a calendar while she was in Auschwitz, when she was in grade school, but the lessons were embedded so deeply that she took them along. When I began to do my research on her calendar, I was able to find the date on which Julius Kissinger, who was massacred in Kovna with his wife and 2 sons, to find the date that took place. There was no one else left in his family. And when I told Sophie Zollberg about this and the date, the 5th day of the month of Kislev, she then every year since, which is approximately 5 years, lights a candle in memory of him. On that date. So the anniversary becomes an occasion to be able to turn upside down the loss. It was on that date that that person's life was criminally taken. We do all we can to give life back on that same date. By extension, the Holocaust and its commemoration leads us to think about other victims in other places, other times. Here I'm moving to the last Last segment of my remarks, and then we'll open for discussion. Victims, unfortunately, in so many places, the survivors of the Holocaust thought that when the world found out what had happened, they would be so shamed that it would never take place again anywhere, any kind of concept of mass killing. But they were wrong. In 1981, my teacher, Elie Wiesel, was invited to go to Cambodia, where unfortunately, as many of you know, there was a genocide that took place. And he felt called to go and to witness what had taken place there, talking to the people, being on the scene, telling the story. He writes in an essay that coming to Cambodia took place on his father's yahrzeit, the day that his father was murdered in Buchenwald in 1945. It's the 18th day of Shvat, and that's the day he found himself in Cambodia. So in the essay, he goes back and forth between the sense of, what am I doing here? Shouldn't I be at home in New York and commemorating my father by being in a congregation, lighting a light, studying the texts that are traditionally done for Jews that we've reviewed? And now I find myself here. So one of the aspects of that day is to say Kaddish, the memorial prayer for the dead, and to also lead the services, the prayer services. In order to do that in traditional Jewish way, one needs 10 men. And so the essay describes his efforts at going up to the people who were on the trip with him to Cambodia. Can you join? Are you Jewish? Could you help me? And going from person to person and collecting finally 8. And then what he thought was 9, but it turns out that he wasn't Jewish. And then 9, and just one more, and finally 10. And even though he felt that he shouldn't be there, he was able to say with that 10th, the memorial prayer, and lead the services on the killing fields in Cambodia. And so, at the end of the essay, they come to the end of the prayers when one says the memorial prayer, Kaddish, which he says for his father. But then he hears that someone else is saying a prayer, the same prayer, a young man in the back. And they finish the prayer service. They finish the Kaddish. And he walks up to this young man and says, "Oh, are you saying this for your mother?" Shakes his head. "Are you saying this for your father?" Shakes his head. "Who are you saying it for?" And the young man raises his hand to the killing fields, says, "For them." So the commemoration can go in multiple directions. Even that is saturated with a Jewish idiom can find its own expression to be able to bring dignity, worth to those who suffered an indecent end to their life. So as I close, we come to back to the term protest. I believe that each and every one of the facets of commemoration I spoke to is a protest. That which says that if we didn't commemorate, there would be oblivion. And what our actions do is to say that oblivion will not triumph. We protest against letting annihilation set the terms of existence. We protest on behalf of life, on behalf of even magnifying, enlarging a continued thread of life that continues with each and every one of those who were murdered, a continued thread into the next world. We tie ourselves to them and them to us. And no one can undo that knot. And that's why I believe that the synagogue covering, that red velour on the lectern on which the Torah is read, in merit of Moshe, Moses, David, and his daughter Sarah Pessa, that's why I believe it's at the very center of the synagogue. And it really might be said that that covering is truly at the center of our universe. Thank you. Okay, questions are welcome, invited. And so when it's the traditional practice in Jewish life, when we mention the name of a perpetrator of a crime, deserving of capital punishment, that we follow the mention of that name with the words Yimak Shemo, may their name be blotted out. That in other words, that already shows that that name is not deserving of a currency. There's those who, from a different angle, have argued that we need to bring those names to a court of law and give them their deserved exposure, as well as, if possible, their punishment. And I don't think that there's really a contradiction between the two, because what we're doing by uttering the name and blotting it out is, of course, filled with an explosive symbolic charge. It gives us the power to say that they are not deserving of recollection. But at the same time, it's understanding that they are deserving of the most severe punishment that can be brought. So that's a short answer to a great question, Robert. Thanks. Someone else, please? So maybe to come at that kind of by indirect route. That we have many situations where the date of death of the murder was not known because there was no one to report it. It was known that everyone in that village at one time or another was annihilated, but no one was there to be able to say. So what do we do in such a case in commemorating the anniversary of their passing? So there's different opinions among the rabbis, that some have said that Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is the proper time. Others that the 10th day of Tevet, which is a fast day that is also has many associations with the Holocaust, should be the time. So it's finding even though it's not a historically accurate date, it's giving a date in which the required practices of commemoration can be enacted so that they should not go without. So for someone who does not have anyone left to say their name, and I assume that means no one in the family, no descendants, that we try to with lists of those who are commemorated, to include under certain circumstances everyone, so that there's a collective prayers that are said that then enfolds them in. It may be that we could have and should do better, meaning that there should be a kind of process of assigning to go find those names and become delegates to be able to say. As far as I'm aware, there's not such a delegation, but maybe that's needed. And that along with any kind of research that's done, there is that kind of pragmatic research that brings their names into a pool that can be divvied up. And thus they will have those that become guardians of their name and of their care in the next world. Is that kind of moving toward what you were asking? Yeah? Okay, thanks so much. Others? There's no wrong questions. Please, you are who?
Michael Melch. I was wondering, you mentioned that we give a burial to those who didn't have one because cremation through our words. I was wondering what might be some potential other ways of doing that?
Of giving a burial?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a great question. I was following my teacher, Elie Wiesel, with that understood that words for him, the writing for him, is that kind of making of a tombstone that allows for those that don't have a grave to be able to have a marker, which is one of the central features of burial. Not the only, but one of the central. The other ways are the repertoire of commemoration, the saying of the memorial prayer, the lighting of a candle, the study of sacred text, the giving of charity, which is always a way to be able to commemorate the loss of any given soul and to bring merit to them even when they're no longer in this world. So those practices are, again, they're not able to wrest from a pile of ashes that body. But what it does do is to encase them within sacred actions, which do at least a measure of what a burial does. Why is time more important than place? Jewishly, as you know, time has priority over place. That the first commandment that Jews were given in the Bible as a Jewish people was to make a calendar. And in Exodus chapter 12. And the idea is that we can bring sanctity into our lives through time, through having a day, the Sabbath day, that then culminates the week and is sacred and preserves that sanctity and preserves our sanctity as we preserve it. And also the festivals do similarly. Thus, the subtitle of my book, Keeping Time Sacred, Making Time Holy. So the anniversary of any loss is, I think, a way that we're given an opportunity, as I've reiterated again several times, when we're given an opportunity to act on behalf of that soul. And that particular window of opportunity on that day is particularly deemed to be auspicious. It's not just simply returning to a time that bears the same numbers, 15 or 14 or 16. It's that that day, in a way, has a channel of opportunity that runs through it and a flow of power and energy that we are harnessing on behalf of that person. And their exit from the world on that day is such that then we can take the opportunity of that sad loss and turn it to their benefit. And it's a way that we then are given that mission to, by acting on their behalf, elevating their soul as it's understood in the next world. We truly, I know it's a mind-blowing idea, but we, according to Jewish tradition, we have the opportunity to move a soul higher and higher. And on that anniversary day, the opportunity becomes that much more full of auspicious energy to accomplish that. So that's why I think time is more important than space, but probably not than people. Thanks so much for the question. Please.
Okay, my name is Joan Dagenes, and I have a question. I run a Bible study, a Christian Bible study, and I've been doing it for about 25 years. The same people are there. And lately, they really have been obsessed with questions about death. What is the Jewish ritual? I was really interested in that in the beginning. So when someone dies, immediately they're not cremated. See, so could you tell me what the ritual is for the Jewish faith, community? You know, exactly what's your beliefs and what happens?
Yeah. So in brief, it's quite complicated, but in brief, it's a great question and it's basic. In brief, the body, once it leaves this world, is watched over. Prayers, particularly psalms, are said. until that the body is taken to be ritually purified. There's a particular association known as the Hever Gadisha that then cleanses the body with water to purify and washes and dresses in burial shrouds. And once in those burial shrouds, then the body, it continues to be watched over at all times, hopefully, and then is taken as quickly as possible for burial. And that is in a Jewish graveyard, and that ceremony is also then accompanied by sets of special memorial prayers that are said, as well as the participation of a community to help with the burial by shoveling the dirt, as I mentioned, and also then once the burial is effected, to comfort the mourners ritually. And the tombstone is a very important part of burial, but it's not there immediately. It's erected anywhere from a week to usually a year after, depending on the customs of the community. And there's certain ritual practices what goes on the tombstone, but it's a marker that one is obligated to provide.
Where do you believe the soul goes?
So the soul goes to what we refer to as the next world, which is a world that the soul continues to have an ascent that is at least partially done on the basis of its own merits through what that soul did in this world, and partly on what is done on behalf of that soul. So you're asking about the children of the perpetrators, German children of the perpetrators, and how they might commemorate the Jewish tragedy? Yeah, I see. Well, that's a lot. Meaning I've had probably you have too. I know numbers from who were children of either perpetrators or bystanders or. Yeah. So what is appropriate? Let's go to the different options that I have witnessed. Some believe that they can no longer reside with the German people. They leave. And those who are most, some of those at least, choose to become Jewish as a way to be able to show the firmness of their rejection of what their parents or grandparents were party to. But that's clearly not as far as I know, statistically not the majority. Others find ways to involve themselves with Jewish communities, whether it be in Israel or in Europe or elsewhere, to tend graves, especially in Europe where there may no longer be Jews to do that, to care for aging survivors and help with that through visits or other means. And And still others do that through themselves becoming strident researchers of the Holocaust in a way that they teach the generations that follow in Germany in such a way that oblivion will not triumph. And then there's others that perhaps feel less summoned to do that, and they don't feel it's their role. So I'm really struck and grateful that you so shrewdly brought in this side that I did not address, and that really is extending the parameters of those who might well feel obliged to want to commemorate, and perhaps as deeply as the Jewish descendants in their own way. So the difference, the way that I spoke about it, let's say, the difference is that survivors who we're fortunate to have in our midst, and even those who are no longer in our midst, they become some of the chief assets to commemoration. They give us the language, they give us the witness. It's their words that, either written or oral, then allow us to be able to know what to say and what we're to respond to and what to whom and what to commemorate. It's they who give those lists on the side of the graves of those who perished. So those who did not come out, they often did not have a chance to leave that same kind of legacy and to work in such collaborative ways with us to become our chief agents of being able to authentically commemorate. But they then, those who perished, those who were murdered during the war, that they are they too may have a legacy. That is, they certainly have a legacy, and that legacy may be greater than we know. It may take more effort to ferret it out. It may take more investment in time and knowledge to be able to know where to go to look for it. But we can find it. Like with my colleague, friend, Sophie Zollberg, her teacher, Julius Kissinger. It's his students that then become those who can tell about him, and that we can build up a composite picture of a teacher of superb quality, with love for his students and excellence in transmitting what the vast amount that he knew. And so step by step, we can bring together a composite portrait that becomes enlarged by each and every one who knew him. So I think that they're more similar than we might even think at first glance. And certainly the commemoration would seemingly need to be common to each in the immense respect that we give to their stamina, perseverance, their belief in a world that, in a way, had betrayed them, but that they continue to embrace. So may we learn from them and find in a world that may seem at times to have gone awry, that one of the great facets of the survivors and of commemoration is to be able to have a belief that the world can be set back on track, and that each and every item learned and each gesture in behalf of doing kindness rather than malevolence is tilting the world in that direction. So may we be blessed with the strength, fortitude, vision to be able to enact that daily and constantly. Thanks so much.